I want to kind of introduce this by talking about the whole issue of our students being transgender and how that's something that's new to many of us. As a matter of fact, I don't consider myself an expert on this. I'm hoping very much from your comments and your discussion toward the end of this to actually increase my knowledge also. So hopefully we'll be able to help each other on this. Let's see, I think I have to do something here. Screen. Okay. All right. I'm hoping that you're seeing the slides, and we're going to start going, and we'll talk a little bit about our roadmap today. As you notice, I put as a subtitle to the presentation today, Ensuring the Safety of Our Transgender Students. And I want to, even before I introduce myself a little bit, I want to talk about why I chose that. Many years ago, when I was with Dade County Public Schools, we had some wonderful workshops done by the Yes Institute. And this is a Miami organization that serves to assist and advocate for students who declare as LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And one of the things that I took away from those is that no matter what our personal opinions are and our perspectives on this, there is something that we can agree upon, and that is that we want all of our students to be safe in a school. And so if we take that perspective as a common denominator, as a joining point for our discussion, let's see, I'm getting a message that my voice is a little bit too low. So if I can, I'll try to project a little more and speak up, and hopefully you'll be hearing me okay. So I would like for the perspective here to be that everything we're going to talk about today is oriented toward the safety of transgender students. And I'll go into some of the statistics as to why that's important. The second thing I want to talk about is, why am I doing this? By virtue of my experiences in both private and public school systems over the last 30+ years, I've had the privilege to work with several families and several students who have indicated that they are transgender, or that they may be questioning that kind of thing. So I've really had the privilege of some firsthand work with some of our folks who are struggling with the situation. And that's why I volunteered today to kind of lead this discussion. I want to give some acknowledgments, and that is that one of my students, or two of my students, have helped me a great deal with the research behind this presentation, particularly Melissa Conover, who is a graduate student in our doctoral school psychology program, as well as Brianna Taylor, who is a graduate student in our specialist school psychology program. And I've already mentioned I owe a great deal of gratitude to the good folks at Yes Institute. Okay, we're going to go over some definitions and statistics so that we know some of what the research is telling us about safety issues. We're going to go through some of the myths around transgender individuals. We're going to talk a little bit about development of sexual identity orientation. We're going to talk about some of the challenges for the family when the student comes out and says, I think I may be transgender. We're going to talk more in depth about the challenges for educators in terms of how a safe school situation can be achieved and maintained. And finally, and I'm going to spend more time on this, what are the challenges for us mental health service providers, and in particular for school psychologists working within educational settings. And we're going to follow that with a discussion in terms of, and I hope to generate a lot of questions and comments from you folks who are watching. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the statistics in perspective, and these are by the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, or GLSEN, in their 2013 report on school climate. It's based on over 1,400 youth who have identified as transgender. So what they found is that 75% of the students reported feeling unsafe at school because of their gender expression. 59% were verbally harassed. 32.5% were physically harassed. 16% reported physical assault at school. 42% were prevented from using their preferred name. 59% were required to use the bathroom of their legal sex as opposed to their preference. And 32 were prevented from wearing clothes inappropriate based upon their legal sex. So as you can see, these 1,400 students, and this is fairly recent information, had some pretty significant risk factors that they experienced. To back off a bit and to talk about it in a more general sense, of the adults in the United States population, approximately 0.5% identify as transgender. You might be surprised in the second circle to note that only 700 to 3,500 actually take steps to transition from one gender to another. 90% of the adults reported harassment or discrimination on the job, and 53% reported being verbally harassed or disrespected in public places. So as you can see, being transgender is not such an easy thing to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk about some definitions. So we're using the terms that are most descriptive. Transgender is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or gender expression differs from what is typically associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. Transsexual is an older term coming from medical or psychological communities, and this is preferred by some people who have permanently changed or hope to change their bodies through hormone therapy or surgery. We use the other term on the page, that is gender nonconforming, to talk about folks whose gender expression is different from conventional expectations of masculinity or femininity. Okay. So what are some of the myths that we have all encountered, or some of us have encountered, regarding folks who are transgender? The first thing is that transgender youth are thought to experience the same issues as those who identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And this is kind of a natural assumption that we make. However, it's not a very accurate one, because individuals in the other categories are experiencing a different kind of situation, as well as different reactions from the general public. We might think that transgender individuals will identify as either strictly female or male, and that's not always the case either. So again, what we sort of traditionally think and we come to expect from people in regard to this is we need to back off a bit and really listen carefully and see what they're telling us in terms of how they see themselves. And finally, it would be kind of an assumption many would make that all transgender individuals make a transition via hormone therapy or surgery from one sex to another. That's not the case either, as you saw before. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how this may develop in terms of young people. Generally, children develop their gender identity. And remember, we're talking about gender identity is feeling like you're a boy or a girl. We're not talking about sexual orientation in terms of who you may be attracted to. So it's important that we don't confuse those two. So generally in preschool, children develop a sense of gender identity. They start to differentiate between boys and girls, and they start to understand and incorporate society's gender expectations of boys and girls. Children who identify as transgender oftentimes feel the mismatch between what they feel inside and what their body tells them between the ages of 9 and 12 years. And as you can understand, this is generally when people go into puberty. So you may have some feelings before that in terms of there being this mismatch, but it really comes home at that point in time. In terms of your cognitive development, we begin to understand social comparisons and abstract conceptions of self and more sophisticated versions of what a gender role is. You know, what is expected of me as a male or a female in our society. And finally, between the ages of 12 and 19, and this is obviously the post-pubertal time, we may feel that our body is betraying us, basically. That here a person has a sense very strongly that they're male or female, but the body is going in a different direction. And as you can imagine, as you can well imagine, this can lead to some significant depression, neglect of oneself, and even self-destructive behaviors. So let's talk a little bit about how this might present a challenge for families. As parents, as I am, and grandparents, as maybe some of you are, we all have dreams and hopes and expectations for our children and our grandchildren. And that begins sometimes probably even before birth, you know, even when we start to learn, oh, is it going to be a boy or a girl? And we start painting bedrooms certain colors, and we start buying toys and things like that. As siblings and families, we look to our older brothers and sisters to provide us with role models and mentorship, and we look to our younger siblings with affectionate and comradeship. If my younger brother is watching, he may make a comment that that isn't always the case, that sometimes there are things like sibling rivalry and etc. But I hope he understands. How do we fit a family member who identifies as transgender into this story, this narrative of hopes and dreams and expectations? It's a challenge. It's a challenge. And here's where families oftentimes need some professional support in working with this. I was recently involved in a presentation to some middle school parents, and one of them made a tremendous comment. She had a middle school child as well as a 23-year-old child, and I think she may have had a third child too. And the gist of her comment was that we all have expectations, and we all have this sense of direction that we think our kids should be going in. But one of the important things she learned as a parent is that we have to let that go, and we have to understand and see where that child's natural set of gifts and challenges and inclinations are going to lead them. And that's where I think as parents we have quite a big challenge. Many of us grew up in situations where perhaps we had a parent who thought we should go into medicine or law, or in my case, accounting. My dad really wanted me to be an accountant, and it was very difficult for him to understand that a psychologist oftentimes does not make a very good accountant. So, again, if you have questions and comments and thoughts based on any of this, please jot them down or communicate them with Mr. Gale, and we will take them up at the end. Now, I want to turn to some of the challenges for educators, and I hope we have some of you, watching tonight and listening. I think over the years, it's become more and more clear that the school environment is extremely important for all students. Every student that walks in the door has an opportunity to grow in many, many different capacities. As we've seen from the research I cited earlier, our transgender students are at higher risk for bullying and harassment. And as we saw, this can be physical and or verbal. Clearly, there is stigma that is attached to being different. We notice that strongly in middle school, still hanging in to some extent in high school. But being different is not something that goes down well in a group setting, particularly when kids are a little bit younger. So that idea of inclusiveness, of acceptance, of non-judgmental approach to people, that's something that kids kind of have to learn and develop. And so our kids who are different, and certainly kid who identifies as transgender is different is going to experience some stigma from his peers. This may lead to rejection, some victimization, as we saw earlier, bullying, and ultimately, why would I go to a school if I was having all these very negative experiences? Dropping out suddenly might appear to be a good option. So how do we keep our schools safe for not only kids who are transgender, identify as transgender, but other kids who may be different and more vulnerable to bullying or victimization? Particularly, support groups have been found to be a greatly protective factor for transgender kids. Something called a GSA, or a Gay Straight Alliance, is a group of students in a school, some of whom are LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, some who are not, some are straight. So we have a Gay Straight Alliance where these kids work together to understand some of the challenges that the kids who are LGBT are facing, and how to change a culture in a school to be more supportive, more understanding, and more inclusive of all kinds of differences. It's very important to have a circle of friends. And again, this goes far beyond any particular group of vulnerable kids. Anything that can provide us with better access to good peers who are going to be there as a support to us is obviously going to be very helpful. In many cases, we have licensed and certified mental health providers within school settings and within our community that are very accessible to our students as they experience difficulties. Excuse me. I'm experiencing a little difficulty with a cold. One of the things, particularly within GSA groups, students find that not only can they advocate better for themselves, but they become advocates for other people who are in need of support. So, what are the particular challenges for mental health service providers, and in particular our school psychologists who are working in many public school and private school settings? And I want to take a minute just to editorialize here. School psychologists are probably the best kept secret in the family of practicing psychologists. We have clinical psychologists that most people know about, and that is my background as well as school psychology, and we have counseling psychologists. So we have three kind of different takes on psychology: school, counseling, and most people, again, have not even heard of school psychologists. But in all public schools, we have school psychologists. In many private schools now, we're seeing more and more school psychologists there to provide not only assessment, which we think of the first thing for school psychologists, but counseling and other interventions, as well as consultation for students, parents, teachers, and administrators. So again, we look for advocacy. We want to make sure that every kid in a school is safe, that they have a niche in that school where they can feel a sense of accomplishment and competency. And might not be the kid that is a straight A student. It might be a kid that's really good on the tech crew, for the theater club. It might be kids who volunteer at the Humane Society. There could be a whole lot of different niches for students to find. And part of our job as mental health providers in the schools is to facilitate those matchups between students and the kind of niches that will allow them to grow and develop. Psychoeducation is a term we use to talk about educating people about psychological topics. So one of the things I do, and the people I supervise do in school settings, is to provide something we call advisories to students. And those are brief 20-minute kind of snippets about pertinent topics. Might include drug and alcohol use. It might include how to deal with stress. It might include some clear messages about students who are LGBT. Okay. It's up to us also to make sure that the students and the parents have access to resources. Many times, there are resources in the community that people have never heard of. In terms of transgender students, many people have not heard of the Yes Institute, or GLSEN, or PFLAG. These are all organizations that can be tremendous resources for kids that are making sense of their situation. And finally, we specialize in home, school, community collaboration. It can't, many of the things we try to accomplish in supporting a student's success in school and their academic achievement can't just be done by the school. We have to closely work with the family, and we have to closely work sometimes with community resources also. Finally, one of the things that, again, many people don't know is that we assist schools with risk assessment. What happens when information comes out that a student may have expressed suicidal intent or ideation? This is a good place for school psychologists to come in and assist in the team that is assessing how much risk and how to develop a safety plan for that student. You will have access to this. This is probably too small for you to see on your screens, but these are some of the references and resources that I've been referring to in this part of the presentation. Okay, we're at about the halfway point. I'm going to kind of quickly go through a second section that's more oriented toward school psychologists or mental health professionals. And for this, I have another acknowledgement for Dr. John Murphy, who is in the school psychology program at the University of Central Arkansas. In the 2014 version of Best Practices in School Psychology, he wrote this chapter that's the best practices in solution-focused, student-driven interviews. I'm going to run through this a little quickly since that I'm running a little late here. I want to make sure we have time for everything. What Murphy tells us is that there's a core of school psychology practice, and it involves figuring out what works in helping people change. And I want to make very clear, we're not talking about changing a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. We're talking about helping a person change things in their life that they want to change, that they find are problematic for them. So, what are the common factors of change regardless of a practitioner's treatment model or theoretical orientation? I'm going to run through this kind of quickly. This is really interesting research, and it's quite counterintuitive to what we usually think. Oftentimes in graduate school, we spend a lot of time working on and understanding models of therapy. What are the techniques that we use? And from this pie chart, we look at the green segment, and the research here suggests that only about 15% of a change in counseling is attributed to the model of the practitioner or the techniques that they use. Similarly, 15% is the hope of change that the client brings in. 30% is the therapeutic relationship or the alliance that's developed. And 40%, and this is really interesting, is what the client brings into the situation. And here it really emphasizes, and I like this very much. I use this all the time when I'm teaching my graduate students. When you're sitting down with somebody and helping them make changes, it's their life, it's their efforts, it's their resources and their limitations that they're bringing into it. And if we get the idea that we can change somebody else, we're barking up the wrong tree, as you can see from these percentages. And if you have some questions on this, I'd be happy to talk further. Okay, so what are some of the practical assumptions of this approach? And we're calling it solution-focused, student-driven interviewing. First and foremost, our assumption is that people, including young people, are capable and resourceful. And when you think about it, this is sometimes not the approach that we intuitively take when we sit down with a kid in a school who's maybe in trouble or maybe getting bad grades, or there's some reason that we've been asked to talk to them as a mental health professional. So it's very important to keep this first and foremost in your mind, that people are capable and resourceful. This is a strength-based approach. The second principle or assumption is that cooperation enhances change. It's very important that we work collaboratively. And again, we establish that rapport, that therapeutic alliance with the student, so that they have a sense that we truly are on their side, that we truly understand them, and we truly get what they're trying to accomplish. We keep in mind that every student offers unique strengths and resources that can be incorporated into whatever the intervention process that we establish in the school. And this is an interesting point because it goes against my training in psychodynamic psychotherapy. But for our purposes for this presentation, it is more useful to focus on future solutions than on past problems. And this has a lot to do with the venue that we're providing our counseling services. We're talking to a kid who's being pulled out of a class and they're going to go back into a class. This is probably not the time to help them uncover, deeply disturbing things from their past. There may be other, venues where that is more helpful, but we're really focusing on what's happening in the present time and how future solutions can be arrived at. Finally, oftentimes as therapists, we get frustrated because we see our client or a young person not making changes. We're working in counseling and we're working, and maybe sometimes we don't think they're working. What we have to focus on here is that small changes, very small changes, sometimes can lead to bigger changes. And we need to communicate this to our clients because they get pretty very good from Adriana. Celebrate every tiny victory. Thank you. That's even a better way to say it. And finally, our language shapes reality. And this comes to full circle to some very clear issues with transgender kids. We want to know what name they want to be called by. We want to know what pronouns they want to be referred to by. But at a broader level, we have to be very careful in how we speak and how we use language. And one of the, I'm sorry, I jumped too quickly here. One of the things that this implies is that we listen carefully to the young person and see how they describe their experiences in life. And we try to incorporate as much of that language, as much of those expressions as we can. So they get a very clear message that we're listening, we understand, that we get it. So what are some of the tasks and strategies of this approach? Again, first and foremost, we want to create a culture of collaboration. This is not a doctor in a white coat sitting down with a patient and giving them the results or telling them what to do. We're clearly sitting down on a more egalitarian basis with a young person. We're giving them the credit of being an emerging adult. We're trying to reach in and find that adult and help them discover their true competence and their unique gifts. So we create a respectful environment. We use icebreakers, and that is we might not go in and talk immediately about what the problem is that we think is the problem. We might talk about other things. We might talk about sports. We might talk about hobbies. We might talk about vacations. We might talk about dogs or horses. We might talk about all kinds of different things. When we talk about orienting students, we're talking about orienting them to the process of counseling. And we give them a clear understanding of things like what type of confidentiality in the particular setting prevails. We're going to talk to them about the importance of a goodness of fit with a counselor. And perhaps we're not the best fit, and are there other options? And most importantly, we're going to obtain feedback on a very regular basis. We're going to ask a student, did you find this session very helpful today? Or what could have been more helpful in terms of the time we spent together today? There's really good research indicating that if we do that, we can avoid breaks in the therapeutic alliance, And when ruptures in the therapeutic alliance occur, we can repair them before the person breaks off the relationship. We're going to discuss problems in solution-focused ways. And again, this is the implication that, yeah, you have some issues you're facing, but let's look at how you have tried to, how you have tried to solve those problems before, and what are some new ways of solving those problems. We want to acknowledge and prioritize the students or the young person's concerns. That it's not so much our take on it, but we want to see how they see it. We want to talk about changeable problems, and we want to talk about problems that maybe aren't so changeable, that we have to have some kind of acceptance and understanding of. We want to see how the problems influence their lives in particular areas, and we want to see what kind of attempts they've already made for solutions. Part of this process is consensual goal setting, so that we develop goals that matter to the young person. As you can well imagine, if we don't do that, there's not going to be much investment in the therapy process or the counseling process. So we can also link the students' goals and values to school-related goals. So if I want to be a veterinarian, but I'm getting terrible grades, it's going to be difficult for me to get into you put the linkages together. In some cases, we might ask miracle and scaling questions. A miracle question is basically, how would things be different tomorrow if you could wave a magic wand and make any change you wanted? Now, that's one we have to be a little cautious with in terms of transgender students, because that could be very loaded, as you can see for them. And we might not ask that in the beginning. We might want to really, develop our relationship first before we got into that. But scaling questions are universally applicable. And here is where we ask a person, you're feeling sad, or you're feeling anxious or nervous, you're feeling angry. On a scale of 1 to 10, how angry, how nervous? You'd be surprised how many times that you think you know what a person is expressing in terms of their experience. But when you ask that scaling question, you get a very different answer. And finally, as I noted before, we want to incorporate the student's language and their perception into the goals as much as possible. Finally, we want to build interventions from what is right. And this is a strength-based approach. So we're going to look and see what are the exceptions to the troublesome symptoms. If a person is anxious, they're not anxious 24 hours a day. So under what circumstances might they not be so anxious? And can we exploit and build interventions from that knowledge? Okay. So to wrap up, I hope I've given you something to think about in terms of this approach, client-directed solution-focused counseling or interviewing. Is this a good fit for school psychologists working with transgender youth in school settings? Transgender students tend to be marginalized and, as we see before, are at high risk. One of the statistics that I don't think I mentioned before, and if you forget everything else I said tonight, this is one that I want you to take with you. And that is, our current research indicates that a person who identifies as transgender has 41% of the people, adults who have identified as transgender, have attempted suicide. And as you can imagine, this is a huge percentage. So this is something to keep in mind, that our students are at very high risk. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this today. Marginalized clients are rarely asked their opinions or viewed as having much to offer toward solutions. This approach incorporates systematic client feedback, as we mentioned before, so it works against the second bullet. It privileges people's voice in their care, so again, you're going to see more involvement, more buy-in. It works with their preferred future and related goals, and again, this is a highly individualized recognition of a person's unique goals and values and dreams. As we said before, it draws from strengths and resources to develop acceptable interventions. Acceptable is really important because we may think we've got some great interventions, but when we talk to the student, that's just not the case. I might think that mindfulness, for example, is a really good intervention, but then my student tells me, that doesn't work with me. You know, I tried it and it just doesn't work. So again, no matter how good our interventions are, we got to make sure they're acceptable. Finally, and this is a comment from Dr. Murphy in a personal communication, he indicated that practitioners resonate favorably with a respectful, client-directed aspect of this approach. They don't feel that they have to abandon what they do well and what works for them. So this is a trans-theoretical approach. No matter what's your preferred way of working, whether it's client-centered, psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, existential, narrative, this approach can be overlaid on any of those theoretical orientations. All right, folks, that's it for what I've prepared. How do we go about our discussion?
Wonderful, Dr. Caproni. I was just listening and learning so much from this topic. So I'm very glad you're able to present it to us. We do have a series of questions that some of our audience would like you to answer. The question concerns during the developmental stage, when does someone start identifying as transgendered? Is that a biological? Is that social? Is that how would you describe that evolution?
Okay, there's a couple parts to the question. One of them is, when does this happen? And that seems to be, from what we know at this point, pretty variable. I've had situations of first graders who have indicated to me very clearly that they feel like their inner gender does not match their outer gender. On the other hand, oftentimes it's not until puberty, so between 9 and 12 years, 13 years or so, that it becomes very clear for a person that there's some kind of a mismatch, an incongruence here but from what I feel inside and what is on the outside. So again, the developmental trajectory, I think, is highly variable from what I've seen. The second part of the question involves more where does this come from? And to my knowledge at this point, we're not talking about something that you're socialized into. We're talking about something that's in the wiring in terms of how a person's brain has developed perhaps before birth and how that translates into their gender identity. These are questions that are good, and I don't know if we have definitive answers, but I'll tell you what my reading of the literature and my understanding of working with transgender kids has told me.
Another question concerning how to act when you experience or see bullying in the classroom. How do you ensure that the person who's being bullied would find some comfort? What do we tell our students or our children to do?
I'm assuming you're talking about observed by a peer?
Yes.
Or we're talking, okay. There's some really... What's that? Or staff?
Yes.
Okay, that's actually two separate questions. So let me start with the peer question first. One thing that has amazed me is the power of a bystander. So that when an ugly comment is made about transgender or race or any other disability or whatever, if another person in that group steps up and says, that wasn't a very nice thing to say, it has a huge impact on that group. It has a huge impact on the person who said the ugly thing and the kid who was insulted by it too. So I think oftentimes we underestimate our power as individual bystanders, that we can come in and say something. And I'd love it if we have anybody in the group here who said something about that. Let's see, sorry, there's a question I think. I didn't understand. I was trying to read here at the same time. In terms of staff, if you're a teacher in a classroom and you observe bullying, then that's something that you have, there's a policy, you've been trained in almost all schools now how to go about intervening and then reporting that. Because that's something that if we don't, as a staff person or a teacher, intervene, it appears that we are tacitly accepting and approving. So that's, again, the power of the teacher is huge in a school. And so you've got to use that very judiciously. Obviously, you don't want to shame somebody, but again, I would imagine myself taking a student privately and saying something to them, or bringing a counselor in, one of the school counselors, to address it with the student. We recently had a situation in my school where a comment was made, and that's exactly the intervention. The teacher communicated it to the counseling staff, and the student was pulled out and talked to them about what they had said.
We have another question, and I'll just read it. I also wondered in regards to that the positive development of a child depends on the degree of support in the immediate environment, such as the parents' view on transgenderism being positive, or community that's more open and supportive. We'd like to see positive results in their development.
Yeah, I think that's clearly the case, that when a person has any difficulty at all in a family, are they able to talk about it? You know, is there a culture in the family? Is there an openness for a kid to come in and say, geez, this happened today. You know, what do you think I ought to do? When you have that open communication in a family, I think that, you know, that you obviously are going to get much more positive outcomes for kids who are transgender.
Wonderful. I wanted to follow up on something you talked about earlier during the presentation about a school psychologist. What exactly is a school psychologist?
A school psychologist is a mental health professional who is either trained at the specialist or doctoral level. In all 52 states, we have school psychologists in our public schools. The minimal training is at a specialist level, which is in between a master's and a doctorate, and more frequently now, more and more programs are training doctoral school psychologists. At NOVA, we have both programs for people in different situations. So what they do in a school setting is to provide assessment, which most people know about, psychological or psychoeducational testing. Most people understand, too, that we are trained to provide counseling. We do group counseling, individual counseling. We consult with families. And we also consult on educational issues and behavioral issues with administration and teachers. In addition, we're oftentimes involved in program development. Oftentimes we're asked to speak to PTAs and to address things, you know, to parents. So there's a really wide range of roles that school psychologists play in public and as well as private schools.
Another question we have, we talk about the relationship between the staff member, the teacher, and the transgendered individual. But what about parents? What kind of education or training would you have for parents?
This is for parents in general or for parents of identified transgender kids?
I guess both.
Okay. On a general basis, I think we would do one of those big PTA meetings with parents and talk to them about diversity, acceptance, how different kinds of kids all bring unique kind of advantages and sometimes disadvantages. But since transgender issues are so new, I would probably do something, I'd probably offer a specific workshop along the lines of what we're doing here for parents. In terms of parents who have a child who is transgender, identifies as transgender, I would most definitely recommend that they receive some supportive counseling as a family, as well as for the individual kid. Because clearly, you know, this is a complicated situation that, you know, is not the easiest thing to come to terms with and to bring to a positive conclusion.
Wonderful. Is the cause of the suicide attempt statistic among transgendered people from bullying or non-acceptance?
A really good question, and I honestly don't know the answer to it. If we look at individual cases, there's frequently some bullying going on. It would be hard to separate that out, in terms of bullying and non-acceptance. But I think both of those are things we need to address if we want to make our schools safer for transgender kids.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to transition into your role within the department and the program. You mentioned that this university offers 2 graduate programs in school psychology. Would you mind just briefly talking about them?
Sure, I'd be happy to. For many years, about 15 years now, we've had a specialist level program in school psychology. And it's a very unique program because it's oriented to people who are working. So our classes are exclusively done in the evenings and on extended weekends. So you can work a full-time job and still go and get your specialist degree in school psychology, which then in the state of Florida, which we're speaking from now, allows you to be certified by the Department of Education, as well as licensed as a private practitioner, a licensed school psychologist within the state of Florida. And about 9 or 10 other states have that also. Our doctoral program in school psychology was APA approved just recently, a couple of years back. We started in 2011. And this is basically when I came into the program. After I left my school psychology work in public schools, I came in here full-time after teaching part-time for a while. And a doctorate in school psychology allows you, again, to be certified through the Department of Education in the state to work in public schools. But it also allows you to be a licensed psychologist, to work as an independent private practitioner beyond the scope of school psychology also. And this is similar to what the license that you get with a doctorate in clinical psychology or a doctorate in counseling psychology. Most people are not aware of that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Essentially, the school psychologists obviously work with parents, with students in the school district. And so for someone who is interested in working with transgendered youth, is this a pathway you would recommend?
Absolutely. All kids have to be in school. And so by definition, in your school, you're going to have kids who identify as transgender. So this would be obviously something that if is an interest of yours, you would be right at home, working as a school psychologist.
There's another question. I think parental denial and stigma, as well as the typical gender social construct, could set back the progress of a transgendered child. How do you think that could be addressed on a larger scale, in particular for the particular students or children?
Okay, let me see if I understand the question. How would we address on a larger scale the situation where parents may be unaccepting of this or not understanding this well? And that goes more toward the large group education kind of things, where we have for example, a PTA, and we offer an informational session about what this is about. And I think we have a lot of access to information on TV and in the media. Some of that's pretty good, some of it's a little sensationalized, but I think particularly as schools, we can make sure that our parents are getting good quality information that may help them understand better if their kid comes and tells them, gee, I think I'm a transgender person.
Wonderful. So it looks like that is the last question. I do want to, we actually have another question before I transition to the end of our webinar. Someone who wants to become a psychiatric nurse practitioner, does NSU offer this area of study? I am not aware of that because I'm not familiar with the offerings in the College of Nursing, but that's something I could definitely look for. And since you're at Nova University, Marcia, I will definitely email you that information. So let me just write your information down, and I will definitely answer that question for you. Wonderful. So with that said, we're coming up to the hour of 6. I wanted to, again, thank everyone for participating. I've learned a lot within the last hour. I wanted to thank Dr. Pete Caproni for offering this wonderful presentation. Again, his presentation is located in the materials section of your panel. So if you've not had the opportunity to download it, I would strongly encourage you to do that. This webinar was recorded and it will be located on the College of Psychology website. And in fact, we may put it with Dr. Caproni's faculty profile. So if you do a Google search and you find him, this presentation will be associated with him. There's also a PowerPoint presentation on the admissions and financial aid aspect. My hope is that some of you would be interested in pursuing either the specialist degree in school psychology or the doctoral degree in school psychology. So with that said, not seeing any more questions, I would like to thank again everyone for participating in this webinar. And on behalf of the College of Psychology, thank you so much and have a great weekend.
Take care, folks.
Alrighty, good night.